The United States Congress has just given an order that has never been given in the entire 248-year history of America. Military personnel are now being told to go to the White House and physically remove a sitting president. This happened because Donald Trump openly refused to accept an impeachment conviction that the Senate delivered just 47 minutes ago. This is not just a symbolic action or a way to put political pressure on someone. This is the constitutional process reaching its absolute limit. It all started when a president who was found guilty by a vote of 71 to 29, with 20 Republicans voting against him, stood up at a quickly arranged press conference and said he will not leave office. He said he does not recognize the Senate's power and that he will tell federal agencies to ignore what he called a fake coup. When the House Sergeant-at-Arms officially asked the military for help to carry out a constitutional removal order, it means the system that was built to stop exactly this kind of thing has just broken apart. So what caused this extraordinary moment where Congress is actually calling in the military to remove a president? According to the official Senate record that was released 34 minutes ago, the final impeachment vote ended at 3:17 in the afternoon Eastern Time. 71 senators voted to find Trump guilty on charges of betraying national security for his own personal financial benefit. This is the largest two-party majority in any impeachment trial in all of American history. The guilty verdict was based on evidence shown during a 3-week trial. That evidence included communications that had been intercepted, which showed Trump sharing secret military intelligence with officials from other countries. It also included financial records from the Treasury Department that tracked $2.3 billion in payments going to Trump Organization accounts after those secrets were shared. On top of that, 4 national security whistleblowers gave sworn testimony saying they personally witnessed these exchanges. This was not a vote that split along the usual party lines. 20 Republican senators joined all 51 Democrats to remove a president from their own party. Among those Republicans were Senate Majority Whip John Thune, Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham, and Intelligence Committee Vice Chairman Marco Rubio, all of whom voted to convict. But here is where the constitutional crisis blew up beyond anything the country's founders ever expected. Within 12 minutes of the Senate vote being officially confirmed, Trump showed up in the White House briefing room. He was surrounded by people that witnesses say were private security personnel. He declared, "I do not recognize this fraudulent Senate vote. I was elected by the American people, not by corrupt senators. I remain your president, and I will continue to do my job. Any attempt to remove me will be met with resistance." Constitutional scholars immediately recognize this as the worst possible situation. The entire system depends on the person who has been convicted accepting the result. When they refuse, when they openly go against the constitutional process, while still having control over the resources of the executive branch, that is the moment when rules and traditions that have held for 2.5 centuries fall apart in real time. The scene inside the briefing room, according to the journalists who were there, was unlike anything ever seen in modern presidential history. Trump spoke for 8 minutes and did not take any questions. His hands gripped the podium and you could see the tension. Behind him stood about a dozen people wearing dark suits with earpieces. White House reporters identified these individuals as employees of a private security company, not Secret Service agents. One reporter from the Associated Press noticed that the usual Secret Service detail that normally accompanies the president was not in its normal position. Instead, Those agents were standing along the back wall in what witnesses described as a very uncomfortable posture, clearly unsure whether they should stay or leave. The image itself told the whole story. A president surrounding himself with private security or giving a defiant speech against constitutional authority is exactly the kind of situation the founders designed the impeachment process to prevent. What made Trump's statement even more legally problematic was the specific words he used. According to the official White House transcript released 29 minutes ago, Trump said, "I have told all cabinet secretaries and agency heads to ignore any messages from Congress that claim to transfer executive power. I have ordered the Secret Service to keep their normal protection around me as the sitting president. I have told the Department of Justice to investigate the senators who took part in this fake conviction for treason against the American people." Each one of those orders, according to constitutional law experts who analyzed them on CNN within minutes of the speech ending, is an attempt to use presidential power to cancel out a constitutional process. The problem for Trump is that his power to give those orders ended the moment the Senate vote reached 67 in favor of conviction. He is giving orders from a position he no longer legally holds. Here is the full picture of how things reached this crisis point. The Senate trial that ended today began 4 weeks earlier, after 18 Republican senators joined Democrats in writing articles of impeachment. This happened after a classified intelligence briefing on January 20th that senators from both parties described as devastating. According to Senator Mitt Romney, who led the Republican group, the briefing was given by the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, and NSA Director Timothy Haw. It included decrypted written records of Trump talking about classified satellite capabilities with foreign officials. It also included financial intelligence that tracked wire transfers between foreign organizations and Trump properties, as well as classified documents showing 11 separate times when sharing secret information came right before a payment. The trial itself featured testimony from Navy Admiral James Stavridis, who explained how the shared intelligence had damaged ongoing military operations. Former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew walked senators through a detailed analysis of the money flows. And on the most dramatic day of the trial, a National Security Council staffer from the White House testified under oath that he personally heard Trump tell his advisors in September 2024, "They want to know about our Pacific capabilities. I'll give them what they want if they approve the Jakarta Towers." What made the evidence so convincing was that it did not rely on interpretation or disputed stories from witnesses. The prosecution presented intercepted communications, the actual written-out conversations. They showed wire transfer records with specific account numbers and dollar amounts. They played recorded testimony from intelligence officials describing the damage to national security. According to Senator Angus King, who chairs the Intelligence Committee's Cybersecurity Subcommittee, "I went into this trial with doubts. I left completely convinced. The evidence cannot be argued with. The pattern is impossible to miss. Intelligence was shared, payment was received, and this happened over and over again across nearly a year. This is not complicated. It is a direct exchange of something for something else, documented with signals intelligence." The turning point came during the trial's final week when Senator Lindsey Graham, who had been Trump's most loyal defender for 8 years, stood on the Senate floor and gave what witnesses called the most emotional speech of his career. According to the official transcript, Graham's voice broke several times. He said, "I have defended this president through 2 impeachments. I have explained behavior that made me uncomfortable because I believed he was pursuing real policy goals. But after looking at all the classified evidence, after seeing intercepted messages where he admits to sharing information he knows is classified, after looking at financial records that show payments coming within days of those disclosures, I cannot in good conscience vote to let him off. What we are looking at is not a political disagreement. It is a betrayal of the oath we all took. If we let him off despite this evidence, we are saying that no wrongdoing is serious enough for removal. I will vote to convict. Graham's statement shifted the momentum in a way that could not be reversed. Within 48 hours, 5 more Republican senators announced they would vote to convict. The effect of Graham's speech on the Senate floor created a chain reaction that Senate historians are already calling the most dramatic shift in direction during any impeachment proceeding. Senator Ted Cruz, who had been one of Trump's loudest defenders during the trial, put out a statement less than 24 hours after Graham spoke, saying he needed more time to go through the classified materials carefully. Senator Ron Johnson, who had publicly called the charges politically motivated, went quiet and stopped showing up on conservative news programs where he had been a regular guest. Senator Tom Cotton, who was seen as a possible future successor to Trump and had built his career on loyalty to the former president, asked for a private meeting with the Senate Intelligence Committee to look at specific intercepted communications that Graham had talked about. These were not senators jumping on a trend. These were Trump allies who realized the evidence was so overwhelming that continuing to defend him would permanently destroy their own reputations. The trial ended this afternoon with Chief Justice John Roberts presiding, as the Constitution requires. After 3 weeks of testimony, evidence, and discussions, the Senate voted 71 to 29 to convict Trump on the first article of impeachment, which charged him with betraying national security for personal gain. The vote went 4 votes beyond the 2/3 majority needed. Under Senate rules, conviction immediately removes the president from office and starts the succession process. Vice President J.D. Vance was ready to be sworn in at 4 p.m. The Senate Sergeant-at-Arms was ready to carry out standard transition procedures. Former presidents who faced impeachment trials understood that conviction meant removal. Richard Nixon resigned rather than face it. The system always assumed that people would accept the constitutional process. But Trump broke that assumption. His refusal to accept the verdict, which he announced on live television while the Senate was still in session, created a crisis that has no clear solution in the Constitution. The Constitution provides for impeachment, trial, and removal. It does not clearly say what should happen when a convicted president simply refuses to leave. According to Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School, who spoke to CNN 18 minutes ago, the Constitution assumes that people will follow its rules. The founders never pictured a situation where a convicted president would openly defy the Senate and claim the right to stay in power. We are in completely unknown territory. The only solution is enforcement, which means asking the people who control physical force to carry out the constitutional requirement. That enforcement process was activated 23 minutes ago. According to a statement put out by House Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, following the president's refusal to accept the lawful decision of the United States Senate and in line with our constitutional duties, we are asking the House Sergeant-at-Arms and Senate Sergeant-at-Arms to work with the appropriate federal law enforcement and military personnel to carry out the removal order. This action is being taken with the seriousness it deserves. No person, no matter what office they hold, is above the constitutional order. The statement also said that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have been officially told about the Senate conviction and about presidential succession, and that the military chain of command now recognizes J.D. Vance as the commander-in-chief, effective immediately from the moment of the Senate vote. Here is the most shocking part. The most damaging thing is not just Trump's defiance. It is the careful planning behind it. According to sources who know about activities inside the White House over the past 72 hours, Trump held several meetings with private security contractors. He talked about moving the headquarters of federal agencies to places outside of Washington. He also drafted executive orders that claimed to dissolve the Senate's power to impeach. One draft order that Politico obtained and published 41 minutes ago claims to use emergency powers to stop the enforcement of any actions by Congress that are considered threats to presidential authority during a time of national crisis. Constitutional experts immediately said, this document has no legal meaning. It is a piece of paper with no foundation in the Constitution. But it shows Trump's plan. He is not just refusing to leave. He is trying to create separate power structures that go around the constitutional system entirely. The draft orders, according to the Politico report, which reviewed 4 separate documents, show careful planning over at least 2 weeks. One order claims to move control of the Secret Service protection teams away from the Department of Homeland Security and put them directly under the president's personal control. Another claims the power to move the working executive branch to Mar-a-Lago under emergency rules. A third declares that any attempt to physically remove the president is an act of rebellion against the lawfully elected government. None of these documents have any legal power at all, but they show that Trump expected to be convicted and prepared a plan of defiance rather than a legal defense. He planned to lose the trial and reject the result rather than try to win. What is even more alarming is the setup Trump apparently put in place to support this defiance. According to a Washington Post investigation published 38 minutes ago, Trump's team signed contracts with 3 separate private security companies over the past month, hiring a total of more than 200 former military and law enforcement personnel. Financial records show that Trump Organization companies transferred about $47 million to these firms between January 15th and February 3rd. Parts of the contracts that the Post obtained from a source include plans for protecting Trump and his family at multiple locations, setting up communication systems that are separate from government systems, and what one contract calls facility defense operations. Legal experts who looked at the contracts told the Post that while private security for former presidents is normal, these agreements seem designed to create a protective barrier that could resist federal law enforcement, which enters the territory of possible obstruction. Here is what should worry everyone, no matter what their political views are. This moment is the ultimate test of whether the constitutional system can survive when someone who has access to presidential power simply refuses to accept its limits. If Congress cannot enforce a legitimate impeachment conviction because the convicted person controls security resources and has the personal loyalty of enough federal employees, then the impeachment provision in the Constitution is dead. Future presidents will understand that they can do almost anything and face no consequences as long as they are willing to refuse removal orders. That is not a republic. That is not a democracy. That is the beginning of the kind of system seen throughout history, where personal loyalty to one individual replaces the legitimate authority of institutions. This puts the military and law enforcement in an absolutely impossible position. On one side, they have a direct order from Congress to carry out a constitutional removal following a legitimate Senate conviction with strong support from both parties. The oath that military personnel take requires them to support and defend the Constitution. and the Constitution clearly allows for impeachment and removal. On the other side, they have a sitting president who technically remains in office until he is physically removed, who has strong personal loyalty from some personnel, and who is giving conflicting orders claiming constitutional authority. According to General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who appeared on MSNBC 15 minutes ago, this is the situation we train for, but pray never happens. The military's obligation is to the Constitution, not to any one person. A lawful Senate conviction is more powerful than any claim to continued authority. But carrying out that requirement means people on the ground have to make real-time decisions about which orders are lawful. That is extremely difficult. If Trump claims he did not share classified information for profit, he contradicts the intercepted communications that 71 senators reviewed and found convincing enough to convict. If he admits to sharing information but says it was for legitimate policy reasons, he faces the financial record showing $2.3 billion in payments that Treasury investigators described as a direct exchange. If he claims that the president has the authority to conduct foreign policy however he wants, he still faces the two-party Senate conviction that determined his actions betrayed his oath, regardless of presidential power. There is no defense strategy that answers all three of these problems at the same time, which is why his only remaining option is defiance itself. Former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly told NBC News 19 minutes ago, "What we are watching is a president who believes that his personal will is more important than the constitutional order. I served in this administration. I resigned because I saw this tendency. But I never imagined it would reach the point where a convicted president simply says he will not leave. This is how democracies die, not through military takeovers, but through elected leaders who refuse to accept the limits of the system that gave them power." Kelly's words carry special weight because he is a four-star Marine general and because he previously defended Trump during his first term. Even some Republicans who voted to let Trump off acknowledge the constitutional disaster that was unfolding. Senator Josh Hawley, who voted against conviction, released a statement 12 minutes ago saying, "While I disagreed with the Senate's decision and believe the evidence did not meet the standard for removal, the president's refusal to accept the constitutional process cannot be defended. The Senate has spoken. The Constitution provides the solution. That solution must be respected. I call on the president to accept the decision and make sure there is a peaceful transition." So here is what this all means as events continue to unfold in real time. Every federal agency now has to decide which orders to follow. Does the Department of Justice recognize Trump's authority or Congress's removal order? Does the Secret Service protect a president who has been constitutionally removed but refuses to leave? Do military commanders follow orders from Trump or recognize Vance as the rightful commander-in-chief? These are not theoretical questions. People are making these decisions right now, and different agencies could come to different conclusions, creating competing chains of command within the federal government. Reports from inside federal agencies describe total chaos. According to a Department of Homeland Security official who spoke to Reuters 14 minutes ago without giving their name, Secret Service leaders held an emergency conference call at 4:15 p.m. Legal advisors said that Trump's protective detail should stay in place until he is physically removed, but that agents should not get in the way of any lawful removal process carried out by congressional authorities. The FBI also held meetings among top leaders where officials talked about how to handle any orders that might come from a president who no longer has constitutional authority. One FBI official told the Associated Press that field offices have been told to wait for instructions from the director's office before doing anything based on orders from the White House, basically putting a pause on presidential orders until the crisis is resolved. There are also immediate national security concerns. Foreign enemies are watching the United States government break apart in real time. Intelligence services have to decide whether to keep sharing classified information with an administration that is in the middle of a constitutional crisis. Military commanders in active combat areas have to figure out whose orders actually carry legitimate authority. According to Admiral James Stavridis, who testified during the trial and spoke to CNBC 8 minutes ago, our enemies see this as a sign of weakness in our system. When a country cannot carry out its own constitutional processes, when competing groups both claim to be in charge at the same time, that is when mistakes happen. That is when enemies test our defenses. The national security risk is immediate and serious. There are also long-term effects on the Constitution that would fundamentally change how the country works. If Trump successfully refuses removal, despite a legitimate conviction, it proves that impeachment is basically meaningless. Future presidents will know that as long as they keep enough personal loyalty within executive agencies and security services, they can ignore the limits the Constitution puts on them. If Congress successfully carries out the removal, it proves that the authority of institutions is ultimately more powerful than personal defiance, but only after a crisis that showed how fragile those institutions are when someone simply refuses to cooperate. Beyond handling the immediate crisis, this is the deepest test of whether the Constitution can hold up since the Civil War. The founders created a system of checks and balances, assuming that people who swore an oath to the Constitution would honor that oath, even when it hurt them personally. They created impeachment as the solution for presidents who betrayed their office. They assumed that a Senate conviction would lead to removal. But they wrote those rules in a time when personal honor and loyalty to institutions were assumed to be requirements for holding office. They never imagined someone who would simply say, "No, I won't leave," while having enough loyal people around them to make that refusal temporarily possible. This situation is causing absolute chaos throughout Washington and across the country. According to reports from the Capitol, the House and Senate are in an emergency joint session trying to coordinate how to carry out the removal. Vice President Vance, who under the Constitution should have already been sworn in as president after the conviction, is reportedly at a secret location with congressional leaders and military officials figuring out what to do next. The White House is in lockdown, and access has been restricted, according to people outside the building. And the American public is watching live as television news networks provide nonstop coverage of a constitutional crisis unfolding with no precedent and no clear path to a solution. Financial markets reacted right away to the crisis. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 847 points in the last hour of trading, the sharpest drop in a single hour since the early days of the pandemic. Treasury bond yields jumped as investors moved their money to safer assets. In currency markets, the dollar fell against other major currencies as international investors processed what it means when the constitution of the world's largest economy stops functioning. According to economists interviewed on Bloomberg 6 minutes ago, the uncertainty alone could cause a recession if the crisis goes on for more than a few days, because businesses and consumers stop spending when basic questions about who is running the government are unanswered. Here is what makes Trump's strategy so extremely dangerous, and why it is likely to speed up his removal rather than prevent it. By publicly refusing to accept the Senate conviction and calling it a coup, Trump is forcing every federal official and service member to pick a side openly. There is no middle ground anymore. You either accept the Senate's constitutional power to remove a president after conviction, or you accept Trump's claim that he still has power despite that conviction. And for the vast majority of federal employees, career officials who swore an oath to the Constitution rather than to any one person, that is not actually a hard choice. Military law experts point out that service members take an oath to support and defend the Constitution, not the president. When those two things conflict, when a lawful Senate conviction says one thing and a president claims another, the oath requires siding with the constitutional process. According to retired Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell and appeared on PBS 4 minutes ago, the military is not going to stage a takeover to remove Trump. But they are also not going to defend him against the lawful carrying out of a Senate conviction. What we will probably see is the Secret Service and the U.S. Marshals Service acting under congressional authority, doing the actual removal, while the military simply stays out of the way. The president will find out that defiance only works if people follow your orders. And when those orders go against the Constitution, most people will not follow them. This goes far beyond one president or one crisis. It is about whether the United States can keep a system where constitutional processes matter more than personal power. If a president can be convicted by a huge majority from both parties based on undeniable evidence of betraying national security for money and still stay in office just by refusing to leave, then every protection the founders built has failed. That is not an exaggeration. That is an exact description of the Constitution falling apart. Here is the current situation as of this recording. Trump was convicted by a 71-29 Senate vote 58 minutes ago. He refused to accept the decision 46 minutes ago. Congress asked for military and law enforcement help to carry out the removal 23 minutes ago. And right now, as this is being recorded, federal officials are coordinating the task, never before attempted, of physically removing a defiant president from office. According to the latest reports from Capitol Hill, congressional leaders have set a deadline of 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight for Trump to voluntarily go along with the Senate's decision before enforcement action begins. That is less than 3 hours from now. This is not political show business that ends with some kind of negotiated deal. This is the constitutional system being tested in ways the founders hoped would never happen. When a Senate conviction cannot be carried out without military help because the convicted president refuses to recognize constitutional authority, that is the moment when the legitimacy of institutions either reasserts itself through enforcement or dies through defiance. It is extremely important to watch this story closely because the next several hours will determine not just Trump's future, but whether the constitutional system can survive when someone simply refuses to accept its authority. If enforcement succeeds, if Trump is physically removed and Vance is sworn in as president, it will prove that constitutional processes are ultimately more powerful than personal power, even though it took a crisis that exposed dangerous weaknesses. If enforcement fails, if Trump stays in office despite the conviction because federal personnel refuse to carry out the removal, or because it proves logistically impossible, it will prove that the authority of institutions is ultimately just an illusion that depends on everyone voluntarily going along with it. For the first time in American history, a president has been convicted by the Senate with overwhelming support from both parties. And for the first time in American history, that president is refusing to accept removal. Congress has asked the military for help to enforce the constitutional requirement. And in less than 3 hours, the world will find out whether the system designed to prevent tyranny can actually work when someone with executive power simply says no. This is not just another political controversy that will fade from the news in a few weeks. This is the moment that will determine whether constitutional democracy can survive when leaders emerge who completely reject the limits that institutions place on them. What happens tonight will decide whether we still have a constitutional republic or whether we have entered a new era where personal power, backed by enough loyal people, is stronger than written law. The Senate has voted. The Constitution provides the solution. And now we find out whether that solution can actually be carried out when the person it targets refuses to cooperate. The stakes for American democracy as a working system have never been higher. The constitutional crisis has never been more immediate.